If there were a single game series that shaped my love of platformers in general, and shaped what consoles I would want as a child, no other series would fit that bill more than the Ratchet & Clank series. Though I started the series with Ratchet & Clank 2, Going Commando, and would not play the first game until the HD trilogy for the PS3 came out, I still loved the series for what it was. But, did I love the series because of its sequel, and not its first game? Well, hopefully I can shed some light on that with Ratchet & Clank 1. I opted to play the PS2 original for this review, and will do the same for all Ratchet & Clank games on the PS2, since every game past the first game supports widescreen and 480 progressive scan. Either way, let's dive into some background for Ratchet & Clank. Ratchet & Clank was created and developed by Insomniac Games, the makers of the acclaimed Spyro the Dragon series on the PlayStation 1. While they managed to move on to greener pastures, severing ties with Universal Interactive Studios, they definitely went in a different direction with their next series when compared to the Spyro series. Opting to go for a rated teen game focused around gun-based gameplay and platforming as opposed to a rated E collectathon seemed like a natural progression for the studio, since the gaming demographic had grown older since the 90s and even the 80s. And thus, more games catering to older audiences would need to start cropping up eventually. With the newly released PlayStation 2 in hand, Insomniac Games created one of the longest lasting art styles for a gaming series that would span multiple console generations, from the PS2 all the way up to the PlayStation 4. And who knows, maybe even the PlayStation 5 eventually. Sure, resolution-wise, the games could be better, but even to this day, I find that Ratchet & Clank has aged visually well compared to other games in the early PS2 lifespan. Combine the art style with interactive gameplay and an on-the-nose but still humorous story, and you've got the recipe for quite a huge success here. So while the art style and aesthetic hold up, how does the story stand on its own? Let's get into that. Ratchet & Clank's story begins on planet Veldin, where one of our heroes, Ratchet, is building a spaceship to leave the planet that he finds tiresome and boring after growing up on it his whole life. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Solana galaxy, a robot factory on planet Core-2 creates a reject robot identified as Warbot B54296, later named Clank by Ratchet. After being created, Clank views an infobot that informs the defective bot to the plot of our main villain for this game, Supreme Executive Chairman Drek. Drek's plan is to create a whole new world for his people, the Blarg, after their home was heavily polluted by him and his company, and plans on accomplishing this by stealing parts of other planets to Frankenstein them together into a whole new world, to which Drek then plans to sell plots of land to the Blarg for more profit, all while secretly polluting the new world to begin the cycle all over again. Fleeing Core-2 with this knowledge, Clank crash lands on Veldin and meets up with Ratchet. After promising to help Ratchet start his ship, Clank and Ratchet seek out to find the hero of the Solana galaxy, Captain Quark. Traveling from planet to planet looking for Quark and angering Drek further and further, Ratchet and Clank become more involved in saving the Solana galaxy from Drek's plan as time progresses, and eventually both mature into heroes that can stop Supreme Executive Chairman Drek for good. So, that's really it. It's a summed up version of the story, with half of the game primarily being that you are looking for Captain Quark, with the other half focusing on Supreme Executive Chairman Drek. There are nuances within the story that I am not a fan of, however, mainly regarding Ratchet's behavior towards Clank in the middle of the game, but other than that, the only other really main complaint I have is how easy it was for Clank to see Chairman Drek's plan. They are just sort of there in the Warbot factory, not behind any lock or key, which kind of seems strange. You'd think Drek would, hide his plans better. But then again, Ratchet & Clank's humor in part comes from the fact that the game is not even trying to be subtle half the time. Chairman Drek is so cartoonishly evil that it actually becomes endearing throughout the game. The characters throughout the game that Ratchet and Clank meet have their own reasons and needs, all while worrying about Chairman Drek in the background, but not being a main focal point of why they're worried. Drek is ever present throughout the story, either through the actions he has done that put Ratchet and Clank in a tight spot on the current planet they are visiting, or through rather humorous cutscenes that cut to what Chairman Drek is going to be doing next. Sure, the story of Ratchet and Clank boils down to unregulated capitalism can result in destruction, but the characters in the game really sell that point, especially with the voice acting. Overall, the story still holds up to this day, I believe, and it is a great starting point for the series, and a little bit more on the nose and relatable now than it was in 2002. So, while the story holds up rather well, the gameplay, while rough around some edges, definitely complements the game rather well too. Gameplay in Ratchet & Clank can be summarized as this: buy guns, use guns, and platform to use guns on enemies and clear objectives. While that sounds rather boring, it actually has a lot of fun to it with the creative assortment of weaponry sold by Solana Galaxy's main primary vendor, Gadgetron. Each weapon is vastly different from one another and can remain viable throughout the entire game, an aspect that later Ratchet & Clank games would lose track of. From a simple blaster to a flamethrower and a missile launcher, all weapons purchased within the Ratchet & Clank universe use the same currency, bolts. Bolts are everywhere, in crates around levels, inside breakable set pieces and scenery, to even inside of enemies. Bolts are plentiful to come by. However, the problem with bolts in the first Ratchet & Clank game is this. As the game progresses, enemies get tougher, weapons get exponentially more expensive, but bolt payouts from enemies do not change and remain rather low. Some crates hold more bolts, yes, but even those only spawn upon leaving a planet, going to another one, and then coming back to the original planet. The absolute worst and most tedious weapon to get in the game would have to be the titular Rhino, a rapid-fire missile launcher that kills anything and everything but costs a whopping 150,000 bolts. Even if you opt only to buy certain weapons in the game and nothing else, say maybe the health upgrades which cost 34,000 bolts total, you'll still be short the necessary bolts to buy this weapon unless you grind. Luckily, this bolt issue would be fixed by all subsequent Ratchet & Clank games, with scaling and payouts being more charitable overall as the game progresses. But even then, the first Ratchet & Clank still has this problem of you're gonna have to grind a lot if you want to get each and every weapon in the game, while also getting some much needed health upgrades. Different planets, though, to get these bolts, make up the levels of Ratchet & Clank, with each planet having a unique style, aesthetic, and even enemies, barring one or two planets and locations. Each location is split up to 2 or more objectives, one that can move the story forward, and another one that can snag Ratchet some bonus gadgets, upgrades, and even weapons. On these worlds, Ratchet will run and gun and platform to make it to the objective, get a new location to go to, and then do those objectives again. To do every objective in the game results in some backtracking being necessary, but overall it is tightly woven, and the backtracking is never really much of an issue since most of the secondary objectives are just optional. By far, my favorite world in Ratchet & Clank 1 has to be Planet Kurwan, home to the city of Metropolis. Its lively city backgrounds with the lovely set pieces and memorable characters make it a nice and welcoming early world in the game. Now, if I were to have to say my least favorite level in the game, that definitely has to go to the final level of the game, which happens to be where Ratchet started off, Planet Veldin. A lot of the enemies there are really just tank sponges, and when you don't have all the weapons in the game, like how I went through in this casual playthrough, you end up having some issues dealing with some of them. I got most of the weapons that would deal with them overall, but even then I found myself running out of ammunition a lot of the time. Luckily, Gadgetron vendors would be around for me to be able to purchase ammo again, but that goes into a low point of the game I have, which low points aren't too often for me here. I'm not the biggest fan of the hoverboard racing minigame, for example, that is done twice within the game, primarily because the speed you go at is rather slow and doesn't feel too exhilarating. The small puzzle sections with the infiltrator gadget are just that as well, small and simple. The Clank sections where he controls gadget bots are rather tedious, but not too bad overall since Clank can attack alongside of the gadget bots and has at least more than one health, which is something that actually later Ratchet & Clank games would exponentially decrease. Dogfights in the Blarg spaceship or airship can be dull at times as well, but they aren't too terribly bad, and as I mentioned before, with the hoverboard racing, it only happens twice in the game, so it's easily written off if it isn't your cup of tea. Giant Clank is another interesting concept that is more explored in the second game, but as of the first game, feels highly underdeveloped and moves way too slow to make combat with him feel satisfying. Finally, the Gadgetron vendors have a little bit of a problem with how long it takes for you to buy all the ammunition you need. You see, you can only buy one bit of ammo at a time, with some weapons having up to 240 ammunition. That can be a pain. You can stack it up in one purchase, but you don't have an option to buy all the ammo you need at once. Again, this would be something that Ratchet & Clank 2 would fix, but in Ratchet & Clank 1, it's still annoying when you have a bunch of ammunition you need to buy, and you have to go through each and every weapon to buy it. Scattered throughout each of the planets are very well little collectibles that make it more rewarding to explore around each planet and find either golden bolts used to buy the gold, more powerful versions of weapons, or the even more elusive skill points that unlock different extras once beating the game, such as concept art, music, theater, and other goodies. Combine all this with a harder difficulty option once beating the game, known as Challenge Mode, where you start with all of your weapons from the previous run and have more of a chance of getting the golden weapons, and you've got even more of a reason to come back and play this game. Much like how Stuart Copeland managed to give the Spyro series a certain flair and style of music, David Borgard's music, not only just for Ratchet & Clank 1, but for most of the series, have left a lasting impression on me. Each planet has their own unique theme that blends rock, orchestral music, and electronic music into a style that not only gives Ratchet & Clank a unique sound, but also fits the levels and their themes perfectly. With most planets having at least 2 themes, with only a few planets having just one. The music variety of each planet will always give you something to bop your head to, and it never feels stale or gets ear-grating. David Borgard would stay on as Ratchet & Clank's composer well until later entries in the series, and with each progressive games, the tracks would only get better and better. But even with the music in the first game, it started out strong to begin with. Speaking on sound design and voice acting for a second, the sound design on Ratchet & Clank, as well as the sound effects for Ratchet & Clank, helps really immerse the player into the world overall. From crisp explosion sounds to even something as simple as a bolt pickup noise, all these sound effects, when combined with the music, leave a pleasurable experience, and voice acting, while something I don't normally talk about, for Ratchet & Clank 1 is really rather well put together. Supreme Executive Chairman Drek's voice actor by Kevin Michael Richardson is always a pleasure to hear with how upset he gets over the course of the game. I absolutely adore Clank's voice actor David Kaye, better known as Megatron from some of the Transformers series at the time, as David Kaye does a very good impression of a naive young person who's just learning about the world. Ratchet's voice actor is one of my lower points of the game, and unfortunately he would end up not returning for Ratchet & Clank 2. Mikey Kelly did a good performance, but part of the issue was when Ratchet got aggressive in the middle of the game, a lot of people didn't really like it, so they would later replace him with James Arnold Taylor, while keeping the falling sound effect when Ratchet falls down a pit for later Ratchet & Clank games up until Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of the Destruction. Overall, voice acting, very stellar, music, amazing, sound effects, very pleasurable to the ears. In the end, Ratchet & Clank 1 definitely marks a strong starting point for a new series by Insomniac Games after the massive success of the Spyro the Dragon series. The strong story still holds up very well. To the fun gameplay and the excellent sound design and voice acting all create a wonderful experience that people of all ages can enjoy. Going forward, the series will only get bigger and better, with only really 1 or 2 down points in the series overall. As mentioned earlier, there is a PS3 port of Ratchet & Clank, which upscales the game to 720p and adds widescreen support, but those upgrades come with a few caveats. First and foremost, like most PS2 HD trilogies on PS3, the game does not properly support 16:9 aspect ratio, so some areas that would be cut off in the original version are awkwardly stretched for the HD port. At the same time, lighting, graphical, and sound issues plague all the HD versions of Ratchet & Clank PS2 games, which is in part why I am opting to review the PS2 originals rather than the HD versions for the Ratchet & Clank series going forward. I recommend tracking down the original PS2 copies of the game if possible, and playing those instead. Either way, Ratchet & Clank is a series that I hold near and dear to my heart. Definitely one of my favorite series of all time, and has left a lasting impression on me as a gamer for decades. While I do know that there is the other version of Ratchet & Clank 1, the PS4 remake, I'll be saving that for another review in the future. But either way, get Ratchet & Clank and play it for yourself, see where the series began. I wouldn't always recommend starting with this one, as we'll see once we get to the Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando review, but this game is still pretty good on its own and shows a good starting point. So, anyway guys, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching Ratchet & Clank 1's review. See you all next time.